Mahirap kayo. Putang ina, sige. Magtiis kayo sa hirap at gutom. Mahirap kayo. Putang ina, sige. Magtiis kayo sa hirap at gutom.
Pag di nagtigil ng katuturuyan, baka putulin ko ang titilyan.
Tumahimik ko na kayo.
In our fight against communism.
Buhay ang NPA!
Motherfucker! Alisin mo yan! Adik ka ba?
My God, I hate drugs. Mahirap kayo. Putang ina, sige. Magtiis kayo sa hirap at gutom.
We celebrate 100 years of documentary filmmaking in the Philippines. We celebrate filmmakers and storytellers who uphold the truth. We trace the Filipino story as told through the moving image. The showcase films that tackles issues we need to confront, issues that affect the powerful and the powerless. We feature the ordinary doing the extraordinary, the powerless who fight to stay true, the voiceless who fight to be heard, and the poor who fight for what they value. Welcome to the Ang Docu Q&A by Demand. I'm Roland Tolentino, a professor of the UP Film Institute and a member of the Manunuri ng Pelikulang Pilipino. Q&A by Demand is a surprise event based on viewers' demand. The Ang Docu sets up a longer conversation with filmmakers whose works touch and intrigue our online audience. Last week, the Ang Docu opened the virtual cinema with the program Martial Law Never Again, featuring films made in the time between the fall of one dictator and the rise of another, more than 30 years apart. One of these films was A Rustling of Leaves, which came home for its first wide public screening in the Philippines 32 years after its international release. Tonight, we are joined by Nettie Wild, the director of A Rustling of Leaves, all the way from Vancouver, Canada. Nettie visited the country 3 decades ago with a different purpose, but left making a lasting of a crucial period in Philippine history that resonates until today. Welcome, Nettie. We are live on
Hi
Zoom,
there.
Facebook, and YouTube. For those joining us through any of these live streams, please send your questions through the comment box. Later in the conversation, we will be joined by one of the main Filipino crew members of A Rustling of Leaves, Filipino cinematographer, film director, photojournalist, and artist Jojo Sescon, all the way from Iligan City. Best to start with a kind of recap, Nettie, of A Rustling of Leaves. Can you just tell us again the motivations for doing this and why and how you came to the Philippines and how you were able to bring
Oh my gosh.
a
That's a
short
long
version.
story. I'm going to make it short so that we can leave time for your
Right.
questions from your callers. But I came to the Philippines in 1985 originally as an actress. I was invited by the Philippine Educational Theater Association to study lightning theater that was happening in the protest movement. And so I moved all around the Philippines thanks to PETA. And I ended up in Mindanao with a wonderful actress at that time. And we ended up being invited. We got a little note inviting us, asking us if we would be curious to create a play with the Hukbala Hop in the New People's Army up in the mountains for the 17th anniversary of the New People's Army. And we said yes. And we went up into the mountains and an extraordinary event happened. Many, many things happened. But what was really key, what really led to the making of a film was when I met the commanding officer of the New People's Army. He was 2 years older than I was. He spoke impeccable English. He had been on his way to earning his degree in agricultural engineering many years before. He had led a protest against clear-cut logging, and for that had earned his place, his name had earned its place on a martial law list, the kind of list that you never want to be on. And his bishop had contacted him and said, you have to make a choice. You have to decide to stay legal and face imprisonment or worse, or go underground. And I met this guy 17 years later after he had gone underground. And the reason why this story resonated with me is that I come from a province in Canada where logging is everywhere. Trees are everywhere, clear cuts are everywhere. And as a young person going through university, everybody, all my friends, myself, had cut our teeth politically on protesting clear cut logging. And when I saw this person up in the jungle, so neat and tidy, and I was all covered in mud, when I got to know this person, I realized, my God, if I had been born Filipina, maybe I would be you. And that was a shock for me. And it led me to an inquiry to figure out what had brought those people at that time to pick up a gun and go to the mountains. And then subsequent to that, an agreement was made that if I could go back to Canada, raise the money, based on absolutely no reputation at all, I might add, come back with a crew. If these people were still alive, we would make a film. And but there was some caveats in that. And that's that I knew in my gut that I wasn't going to do any favors by making a piece of propaganda. So I had said to them, if we go forward with this, 3 things. First of all, I have editorial control. Secondly, I want to film a tactical offensive and a people's court, both of them very controversial, and I felt would take us to the heart of the complexities that these people had to deal with. And they agreed. So I walked out of the mountains with a film proposal in my shoe. It was on one piece of paper, all folded up really tiny, and set about raising money and finding a film crew and coming back to the Philippines. Many, many chapters happened. But that was basically what brought me back to the Philippines just in time for EDSA and People's Power. Right. And so it was kind of like the wrong revolution happened in the sense of who I was following. So I put our film on hold because people were saying, wait, that the extraordinary events of EDSA are also complex. And the revolution is not going to go away. And so what I ended up doing was making a much more complex movie, and I think a better one that asked, if you were a Filipino, what would you do to bring about what Ed de la Torre calls a nice democracy, a good democracy in the Philippines? Would you go underground with the Revolutionary Army? Or would you attempt to fill this democratic space and see if you could bring about change legally? And what we discovered at that time was that either way, you were going to run into the third part of the political triangle, which was the paramilitary. And the paramilitary were, at that point, shooting at both of them, except for the people who were legal weren't protected. And so that became our film. Rather than just up in the mountains, we were also following the candidates of the Partido ng Bayan and former Commander Dante Burnaby Buscaino as he ran for senator instead of returning to the mountains. That's it in a nutshell.
Exactly.
A very big nutshell.
Right. The film is, you made the film immediately after EDSA, which is, to my surprise, you were already kind of indicting the EDSA revolution as a kind of failing revolution, and that Cory Aquino's promises were not going to be, has yet to be fulfilled, and that a lot of the paramilitary presence, the red tagging, were back in place, and that's why there's a kind of heavy-handed response, at least from me, in the way I view the film again, 32 years after, because a lot of the affect of those kinds of decisions that the politicians and the revolution have made are still very much present today. We have another kind of tyranny in place, and red tagging now officially done by a line position from the government, from Malacanang itself, the office of the president, doing the red tagging of everyone, aimed to be a critic of the state and the closure of ABS-CBN. So there's a kind of continuum between what you have clarified or summarized in your documentary up to the present. I'm sure you've, from Canada, you've observed also what's been happening in the Philippines 32 years after the film has been made, right? So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's interesting because I think that circumstances put me in a position in 1986, which is People's Power, but then 1987 when we shot, it put us in Davao at that time. And we ended up filming a kind of cauldron of complexity, violence, this mix, as the Partido ng Bayan was campaigning and going right into the heart of Davao. We had these 3 points of the political spectrum: the underground left, the legal left, and the paramilitary, all swirling around each other. And at that time, in 1986, right after Mrs. Aquino came to power, President Duterte was appointed as vice mayor. When we were there filming, I think we were there in 1987. I think he had his reign of vice mayor was over, but in 1988 he was going to come back as the mayor. So he was very, very present. Not a key person, not on my radar at that point as an outsider, but the the genie that was let out of the bottle, the paramilitaries who were empowered at that time. I don't think you can stuff them back in. And so, in a funny kind of way, Rustling of Leaves is um, a profile, a tease of what was going to then evolve. And now we have those same dynamics from what you say and from what I've read at the palace and in the country. And so it's a very volatile primer, as it were. And the characters at play included some people who have gone on to become national figures, including a young Lieutenant De La Rosa, who's now, of course, Senator De La Rosa, and our underground commanding officer, who's known as Ka Oris, has now become a substantial leader within the underground movement. Very interesting time that I think, well, certainly for myself. And I guess my question is to our viewers today is, does it resonate? Does it travel? I'm really curious to see.
Before we proceed with those the implications of the film in the present time, especially with a younger generation of viewers, let's just go through some of the questions that have been raised through social media, particularly on the kind of process and risks that you've made in your film documentary, wherein you interviewed right-wing personalities, the young Senator Bato then, and Jun Pala, the radio man who does his bit of anti-communist propaganda in Davao, and some other ethical questions. So I'll be reading 3 questions, and you can respond to these questions as a kind of basket of issues that you, in whatever way you may want to respond.
Okay.
From Josh Malonzo of Twitter, how did you manage documenting an actual AFP and NPA encounter? How did you get away from AFP's crossfire, given the context of the Philippines being the worst for a journalist to cover a story or to even live? From Facebook user Christine Bactad, what are the impacts and challenges you might have gone through as an individual and a filmmaker in making this docu? And from Carl Joseph
Just let me halt you there.
Okay,
let me halt you there. Could you say that question again, please?
What are the impacts and challenges that you went through as an individual and a filmmaker in making this documentary? You mentioned this, some of this a bit ago. And from Carl Lara, on technical and logistical aspects, how did you keep yourself safe amidst a very risky documentary process? After the success of the film, were there any adversities you and the production experience, like threats?
Okay. Well, I mean, all of these questions deal with threat. I just want to make it very, very clear. Of course, I was at risk. I wasn't sitting in my comfortable Canadian home. I was up in the mountains and also following the Partido ng Bayan, which was not a safe zone, I can tell you. But I was surrounded by people who were far more at risk than I was. And I think what tends to happen in this kind of a situation is that you're very aware of this. And so the number one objective is to make sure that me, an outsider, this tall, very white, very obvious person from another planet, does not attract attention and increase the visibility and the safety of the people around you who are already so vulnerable and so at risk and have agreed to be in front of our camera. And so it's in terms of the push-pull, the personal, somebody had asked about the personal versus the professional risks and questions that I faced. This was at the core. That I had to make sure that I wasn't bringing with me an arrogance that was saying, because I am with the media, because I'm carrying the camera, I have a right to know, and I have a right to put you at risk. And that I am going to somehow not be vulnerable myself. And so it was always a real questioning every step of the way inside my head and my heart. Every day saying, what the heck are you doing here? What are you doing? And trying to answer that in as full a way as possible and say, okay, my job is to get these stories out to people, these stories that are complex and surprising, and get them out to the rest of the Philippines, but also out of the country, and to do it in a way that is safe, not just for myself and for others. But the whole business of filming an encounter was a huge risk. And the person who really, really was on the line, because when we went in to film the encounter, I have a really lousy knee, and I have this massive leg brace that I have to wear when I'm crawling up and down the mountains. And the command said, you're compromised. We are not going to put you in a place where you can not only compromise yourself, but other people. And so when it actually came, I was put in a much safer position. Jojo was not. And it was Jojo who was put at extreme risk. And in fact, Paloy, who was one of the Hukbalahap who was detailed to protect us, was killed protecting Jojo. And so, that was a time of, it was, to say it was frightening, it's beyond fear. And insofar as my mission to get the story, but to keep people safe, I failed. Yeah.
Well, there are some other ethical questions posed in social media by some of our interested audience, which also comes by way of the ethics of your filmmaking in the documentary. From broadcast journalist Howie Severino, were you not endangering your subjects by showing all the faces? Was that the reason for the film was not screened in the Philippines 32 years ago? What is the journalist's or filmmaker's responsibilities when they find out that a killing may take place? Did they compromise the safety? Well, you mentioned a bit about this. Did they compromise the safety of Kaloy, who died while protecting the film crew? And lastly, from him, she aired her voice but not her face. Why?
Okay, so the decision to show faces or not was, in terms of the people that we filmed in the mountains, the Underground New People's Army, was made by the Army. They very much wanted to show the human faces behind the story. As Oris put it, we don't want to come across as bandits. And so that meant that there were some people who were not in the frame at all. If you can imagine, the guerrilla fighters are protected somewhat by the army. The people who go up and down into the cities are not. And so those people were not on camera. So there was a whole dance that happened around who was in front of the camera and who was not. The business of the responsibility of what happened with Paloy, of course, I didn't anticipate this, but it's weighed always very, very heavily on me. at one point, Oris saw me struggling with this, and he said, basically, don't be so arrogant. You know, Polloy didn't die for you. He died for the revolution. It was a convenient thing for me to hear. It's always stayed with me. And that is something that, you know, it could have been anybody, not Polloy, just by me being there, a huge risk. That's why I've really been driven to make sure that the distribution of this film is very, very wide. And this is the ultimate irony, is that when we got out and when we made this film, and I just really want to make it clear, over 100 people helped make A Rustling of Leaves, both in the Philippines and also in Canada. When it was premiered, it went to the Berlin Film Festival. We won it. We won the People's Prize for a form of young cinema there. It then played theatrically all throughout Canada, huge distribution in the United States, in England, in France, Germany, Australia. It was broadcast all around the world, but not in the Philippines. And there was, to answer the question put to me, yes, there was a real trepidation of how do we handle this back in the Philippines? You know, back in the day, the two ways that you saw the film was, or three, was in a cinema, broadcast on television, or in, you know, video cassettes. And the first two, I was told, were basically to be able to broadcast it uncut, to be able to show it in a way that we would not be jeopardizing people. We didn't think it was possible. You tell me that there were underground screenings that happened,
Right.
a lot of them. And of course, I suspected that was happening. But in terms of an official launch, yeah, we felt it wasn't possible. And a lot of people are saying, so why now? Because we're hearing that, you know, the violence is still ramped up in the Philippines. And it's because Filipinos have told me that it's worth the risk now, because in fact, it has a story to tell that perhaps can put a really important context in place. So we'll see what happens.
So before we move on to Jojo, here's a question. How from Jewel Maranan, a documentary filmmaker, how has it been for you for the past several days since the public premiere of your film in the Philippines? How does it feel for this chapter of your life from 3 decades ago to go back to the foreground? To go back in the foreground.
I have to thank the film festival for an extraordinary week, because what the screening, the official launch of A Rustling of Leaves inside the Philippine Revolution is doing is that it has, to think that something that we made, you know, 32 years ago has resonance, means so much to me as a human being and as a filmmaker. And then on top of that, on a very human level, I've been able to connect with Jojo again. We hadn't talked for 32 years. And other people who had been really seminal in terms of work behind the camera. We've been having, first of all, Jojo and I talked. The first time we talked for 4 hours on Zoom, all because of this. And then the next night we had another member of our crew, and the next night another one. And it was like the four of us started to cobble together. You talk about a rustling of leaves. It was a rustling of memories as we started to cobble together the extraordinary story that we went through, and the deeper levels of understanding that it took us to. So it's been extraordinary. It's probably been one of the most amazing weeks of my life since the actual making of the film. And you know, there's been some amazing chapters between now and then. Other films have been made, but A Rustling of Leaves it started everything for me. It started my career as a filmmaker, and it led me into a certain kind of filmmaking, which I built on because of very, very important, and I have to say uncomfortable lessons that I met in the Philippines. The biggest one being, God damn it, I'm going to have to keep nosing my camera into people's lives and asking them to be vulnerable in front of my camera and film as many sides of the story as I can and keep the editorial control myself. That's a very, very hard ask to ask people in the Philippines and then later in Mexico and in Canada where we filmed. But I think it creates a film that's not propaganda, but very, very hard for me and for the people that we're filming. So it's been an amazing week. So thanks to Jewel and everybody at the festival for making this happen.
Right. Yeah, this is a good time to bring in Jojo, no? Jojo, or Antonio,
Yeah.
Jojo Sescon, is an artist, an activist, and an environmentalist, and he worked on A Rustling of Leaves, a second cameraman in 1986. So, Jojo, how does it feel for people to be able to see finally the film in this kind of nationwide way online, albeit? And also, how does it feel to be reunited with Nettie and the rest of the crew of the A Rustling of Leaves?
Actually, I'm very happy. I could not even contain my happiness. This is something like this rustling of leaves is really has a big part of my being. It makes me I become a filmmaker because of it. And for 32 long years, I've not spoken about it. And this is it. This is the time. And Nettie asked me if is it okay? Are you safe? I said, no, it doesn't matter anymore because it has to be shown. This film should be given back to the Filipino people to know what's the past, and it is a big release on my part that I can talk now openly. And with Nettie is really, really amazing because it's not just easy to work with somebody who cannot really, who lacks understanding of what's the film all about. But Nettie has all the sensitivity of knowing all the many form of arts incorporated into the cinema language that it's really amazing to work with her.
But what were your thoughts when you were filming at the moment? The vital scenes of the People's Court, the military encounter, and Kaloy's death.
Well,
we heard Nettie's side. How was it from your end?
Well, I thought I was I'm hard or distant from those human feelings of, because I learned that from as a photojournalist, but it's different because when you go through the process of really understanding and interacting with the victims and the people who are really on that situation, you develop something different level of emotion. So during the execution, actually, I thought I can handle it emotionally, but when the right time comes, at that very moment, I was crying.
What about 32 years after? Do you feel that the film still resonates with the kind of power and with kind of scoping of issues then? Are they still relevant, you think, for younger generations of viewers and Filipinos?
Actually, there's nothing that has been changed. It's almost the same. Our government now is I don't know. I do not really understand, but it's not the people's fault, because this is the kind of the situation that really reflects the same as before. So,
Mhm.
but I don't have the energy now to be part of because I'm old and
Well, Nettie still has plans to go back to the Philippines and to scout for whatever collaboration and she might be able to do here with filmmakers from your generation and her generation and even up to now. So I hope
And younger ones.
and younger ones. So Jojo, do not say you're too old.
I just want to say too, you know, when you referred to Jojo as being the second cameraman, Jojo was the only person who would go up into the mountains with me.
Right.
And so, you know, he was the first cameraman. and when he talks about that emotional time of being, you know, we were touched by the very deep complexities that we were faced with. And so I remember when, you know, the encounter just happened like an explosion, but the execution was like watching, you know, a nightmare in slow motion, because it was the end of a people's court and something that I thought was really important to film. And I think, to be honest, that the leadership let us film that people's court because they thought that the young man who was being tried, you know, that there was a chance that we would actually see a compassionate side of the revolution, and perhaps things would go better for him. And I remember when we were filming that People's Court, I remember seeing this long list of fears that people had, that the villagers were expressing, and the Datu. And I remember seeing the look on Father Frank Navarro's face, who was running the People's Court. And I could see, on a human level, I could see him going, uh-oh, this is not going well for this young guy whose code name was Batman. And it's not, and we're being filmed in the middle of this, that they had taken this risk. So when the decision came down that, in fact, this young man had betrayed the community, and as one of the people said, what do we do with him? Right? Our camera was confronted with this huge contradiction and complexity that the people in the villages, never mind the Revolutionary Army, but the people who are living day to day are confronted with. And it was very, very shocking and deeply moving and complicated. And it was like a train that couldn't be stopped, and we were on it. And the emotions were huge, not just for the people in front of the camera, but for those of us holding it.
We'll now be entertaining questions, Nettie, from the audiences here in the Zoom meeting. From Tyrone Velas, I'm a writer from Davao City who grew up hearing the tales of June Pala. The film showed how crazy he is. How was it being up close? Sorry, the chat side is moving up. How is it? Being up close, interviewing June Pala in his booth, and probably even De La Rosa in the war front?
Well, they were very different. June Pala was in his broadcast booth, encased in glass. with his companion with his M16 behind him. We were crammed inside this hot box, made even hotter by our lights shining down on him. We returned 3 times. I was aware that Pala liked being filmed. He was a performer. He was a performer whose performance included threatening people's lives. And so you had this man who, I realized the longer we were there, the more it fed his ego. The more it fed his ego, the more he opened up. And the contradictions that he presented were huge. You know, he had this humor and this ability to communicate, and he's holding on to the philosophies of Goebbels, which is a philosophy of lies and terror. So as we would film him, and then we go out to the community, and we would be filming the results of these words, which weren't so funny. And then
you were
finally,
also threatened. I mean, you and your crew were also threatened by Pala.
But that didn't happen until the last time we were there, which was on purpose, right?
Okay.
Because I wanted to get this dance. I wanted to get this extraordinary person behind the voice, which was going out night after night after night to the people of Davao and surrounding areas. It wasn't until the very last time that we were there, I said to, or it turned out to be the last time, I asked him, what is your link to this labor organizer who's been named on your show, who's now dead? And he started to realize that we were making connections. We were making connections between him and what he said and what the paramilitary death squads were carrying out. And it was at that point he turned very cold and looked straight into the camera and said, "I'm not finished my war yet. I will kill even the media." And at that point, I remember Kirk Tugas, who was shooting at that point, muttered to me, "It's a cut. We should get out of here." And then seconds later, there was this huge crack that happened, and our lights had cracked the glass in his broadcast booth. But everybody thought it was a gunshot. So everybody was on the floor. And then we left. So that was our relationship with June Pala. And very, very important sequence in the film, because he gives voice to the threats that everybody else was denying, which brings us to Lieutenant De La Rosa, because at that point, the Armed Forces of the Philippines was very, very clear that they weren't working with the paramilitaries, even though the paramilitaries were sanctioned at that point by Mrs. Aquino. And so in the following of the death of the labor organizer, we realized that we were told that a particular detachment was questioning people who had been threatened, and that they were, we were told that they were indeed working with the paramilitary. The paramilitary was at least there in that detachment. And when we pulled up, Jojo was there, when we pulled up in our Jeep that had, we had written the word press on the front, thinking that this was, going to be some kind of protection. And we drove up to that detachment, and my first introduction to not so much Lieutenant De La Rosa, but to his detachment, was that they opened fire on us. And the reason they opened fire was because they had indeed been questioning somebody. And when we arrived on the scene, it broke their concentration, and that prisoner took advantage of it and ran straight towards our jeepney. And so the soldiers opened fire, we hit the dust, and then dusted ourselves off and introduced ourselves to a very young Lieutenant De La Rosa. And I think in the questioning that happened with him, we spent some time with him, but I was really curious, like, how are your men working or not working with this particular paramilitary group, which was called the Tad Tad or the Chop Chop? And at first, he denied it, but was kind of leading the conversation to give a sense of kind of containing these paramilitary groups. But as the conversation goes on, he reveals that there is more of a connection than is comfortable between him, the army, and the paramilitaries. And interestingly enough, the senator has taken these two clips of him and that encounter and those soldiers, and has taken them out of context of the film, clipped them together, and put it out on Facebook. It's like a trailer that we never had. And
Recently?
So it's now, in the last week.
Wow.
So apparently there's over 800,000 hits. So the senator is doing some advanced publicity for us, but without the context. So what I'm hoping is that people who see that clip might be a bit quizzical and will see the whole film, and maybe the film will add a little bit more of a context to that. Yeah. So very, very different experiences with those two men. June Pala has since then been assassinated.
Maybe you can ask Jojo later what happened to the fate of June Pala, because when I Googled, there were some implications of Duterte being a kind of mastermind to the assassination, or even motivated the assassination. Jojo, were you familiar with that kind of gossip or inner story about June Pala and Duterte?
I don't have any information about that.
Okay.
That's a hell of a question to ask. I mean, think about it. I mean, there are many rumors about many, many different things. But I saw one news report in which, it was there was clearly a conflict between Duterte and June Pala, and in that news report, June Pala was being portrayed as the underdog, which when I read it just went, oh, wow, life can be contradictory. I mean, check this out. If he ended up being killed as the voice of the underdog and compared to the role that we saw him in, that's complex.
Right. I like the De La Rosa sequence in your documentary, because it showed that he wasn't smart then. I mean, he was implicating himself slowly in the unfolding of his story, of how
I thought so.
Right. And
De La Rosa,
that kind of foregrounds how he became a prominent politician by way of masterminding this war on drugs and becoming a senator. Always being caught, like what they say, a fish is caught through its mouth. So he always kind of implicates himself slowly into the whatever controversy he wants, but simply because he wants people to talk more about himself, whether for good or for bad.
Well, that puts the context of this trailer that he's cut together. So thank you for that. I mean, it's mystifying. I think that he's put out a trailer that incriminates him, but he's this very young, handsome, macho guy. And I think that's the spirit that it's been put out. And the responses are very much people saying, you were fighting the good fight then and you're fighting the good fight now. So, I just hope those people watch the film. And all I'm asking is, enter into the complexity and the humanity that we ran into. And then it's good if you're scratching your head, if you're so firm in your beliefs in one direction, maybe A Rustling of Leaves can make you question, as it did us, Yeah.
There's a question from Leo Baltar from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. It's very common for the Philippines to be the subject of many international filmmakers. Given this, there has always been a discourse about how a foreign perspective would play on a local issue, such as the Philippine armed struggle. How did you situate yourself on this while making the film?
So it wasn't for me to be arrogant enough to think that I was going to get the whole picture or hold forth on what should happen in the Philippines. When I was, answering that inner voice that was screaming at me, what the heck are you doing here? That was a part of that questioning. It was profound. And the answer, I guess, is the answer to your viewer's question. It was, for me, it was to go back to that original question. What about if this was me? What about if I was a Filipino and I had to make a choice of how to be a part of a movement towards a good democracy? What would I do? And that's what that was my job, was to put my Canadian audience, my American audience, and hopefully later the Filipino audience that perhaps wasn't in the mountains, but was in the urban core, put them in that position, say, what the heck would you do? And that within that, there were no easy answers. And within that, we could meet people that would allow people to see the hearts that beat within that complexity. And hopefully, the sound of the dull thud that you hear in the background are stereotypes hitting the ground.
Right.
That was so important. I mean, I came from a very, very conservative family in Canada. And my mother in particular was really a right wing. And the people that I was talking to, certainly the people in the mountains, but even people like Dante and the Partido ng Bayan, this was an anathema to her and to a lot of people where I moved. The idea of a communist armed revolution being peopled by people who are driven there by poverty or by violence never crossed their mind. And so, that was my job. And that was my answer to that, that very loud voice. And especially when things got really complicated. I mean, it wasn't easy either along the way because, it's not like the underground nor the Partido ng Bayan just opened up their doors and said, "Oh, welcome in." There was complexity there. There was times when the leadership of the movement underground said, "No, she's not coming up." She said, "Why? Well, we got a war to fight. Why do we want to have this very visible outsider can't speak the language? What she wants to do? What? Where?" But because I had gone through an extraordinary story in 1985 originally with the people up in the mountains, we shared a human experience. We had seen each other. It had cut through the stereotypes. And because of that commanding officer said yes instead of no in the face of real opposition. And this complicated movie was made.
Thank you, Nettie. JP Campos has a cluster of questions. JP Campos is the editor of Media Commoner. And this one is also a question for Jojo. What equipment did you use in the shooting? What was the technical and logistical approach when you shot the film? Did you have other intentions when you created this film other than simply telling the story? What do you think is in a storyteller's nature that you feel the heavy need to be involved? And for those who are afraid, what can you tell them to help them break out? Jojo first?
Oh, sure.
Well, it really takes deep understanding of the topic that you are documenting, because you will never get the heart of the story, the human element, if you're just in the surface. So, and also technically, we have two types of cameras. The hand crank, it's you don't need any electricity, and also the one that has it's good for interview. So I think all the rest Nettie can answer that.
Well,
Thank you,
just
Jojo.
let me just jump in here in terms of the technical side, because it actually spins into a very human side as well. So the two cameras that Jojo refers to, we had this big Aton camera. It was worth, like $80,000. I had managed to convince the National Film Board of Canada to lend me this camera and 6 beautiful Zeiss lenses for 3 weeks. I had it for 8 months. And one of the agreements that we had when we were up in the mountains with this commanding officer was that if we were to be attacked, that we would run and we wouldn't be stupid and be loyal to the equipment and try and lug it with us. So every night we would take this $80,000 camera and these extraordinary Zeiss lenses, and we would bury it. So not only did I have that camera for 8 months instead of 3 weeks, but we were burying over $100,000 worth of film equipment in a jungle, and have to remember where the heck it was in this jungle.
Don't mention where it is.
Then because we were filmmakers and we were there to do a job, and should such an event happen, we would have to film. We slept in our hammocks. These hammocks are made out of rice sacks, right? I took 2 rice sacks because I was so tall. Everybody else in the army was in one. And inside our hammocks, Jojo and I each had a Bolex wind-up camera and a Sony Walkman tape recorder that we slept with. And so when you ask this question, or when your viewer asks this question about the technology, I remember those nights squished into my teeny hammock with my Bolex sticking into my ribs, hoping like heck that nobody attacked. Those were the logistics. We also really tried to bring in the middle of all this, bring a real poetry to A Rustling of Leaves, knowing that the best poetry captures dark as well as light. And so Jojo has a beautiful eye, and so does Kirk Tugas, who trained Jojo so that he could come up into the mountains with us. And our whole crew was out to find the nuance and the rhythm, and yes, the beauty in everywhere that we were in terms of our frame. And that's why we were lugging all this equipment with us. And also it was 1987, so we were shooting in film. We didn't have any options.
How many feet of footage did you shoot?
64,000 feet.
Wow. This is
which we thought was a lot at that time. And it is a lot if you're carrying it on your back.
Right. So this is a question from filmmaker Hiya Saturay. What were some stories you were following that didn't make it to the final cut, but you would have wanted also to share?
Oh wow! Now I'm going back into memory, into my outs. Well, I would love to have spent more time. It wasn't so much leaving people out, but leaving aspects out of these incredibly complex stories. So there was a whole phenomenal backstory to Dante, for instance, to put him into some kind of larger context and what he was doing at Tarlac and his backstory and how the crushing poverty that he had lived in. And to find it would have been, we had amazing interviews with him and his sister about the real, oh God, they were amazing snapshots of living as the poorest of the poor sugarcane workers who they used to come out at night and steal cane to suck on at night because they were so hungry. There was so much stuff that we couldn't include. Similarly, when we were up in the mountains, we interviewed a lot of the people there, just saying, who are you? Where do you come from? It made the leadership very nervous at first, because the last thing they want is people revealing who they were and their real lives. I wasn't after names. I wasn't after the particular villages, but I did want to know, like, what are the dynamics that brought you here? And we heard phenomenal stories. Couldn't make it into the cut. We had to be and there was a lot happening in so many different ways. There was a lot happening on the legal left beyond just the Partido ng Bayan. And we tried shoehorning some of that in terms of the demonstrations that were happening. Putting the Sparrow, we just doffed our hats to the Sparrow units. That's a pretty complex story, which we shoehorned into, I would argue, too tight, too small a mention. So all of that, understanding who the people were behind the sparrows that we filmed. There was one guy in particular who just had he was a labor union organizer who he not only got targeted, but his whole family was targeted, and he referred to them as they were family was blown apart, and they were like a scattering of seeds over the land, with now homeless and no way to really even eat. And those were the dynamics that drove him underground. Couldn't include that. On and on and on. Interestingly enough, we're just cataloging all of A Rustling of Leaves and sending it off to the University of Toronto archive so that it can be in their cold storage. And so I'm revisiting. In the last year, I've been revisiting what's in those rolls. Amazing. It's an incredible catalog of Philippine history. And so I want people to know that it's there, and it's going to be well stored and eventually digitized and available to world citizens and to Filipinos. Mm-hmm.
What about you, Jojo? Would you remember a particular scene or a character or subject of the film that you thought would have, you shot it nicely and the story was compelling, but kind of missed out that it wasn't in the film?
Actually, there's a lot, but I cannot enumerate. But because knowing a lot of characters there really leads you to think another story. So actually, right now, I would really like to make an interview with Kaores, because just to make a follow-up of what is what's the situation now.
Right. How young is Kaores now?
What was the question?
How young is Kaores now?
Well, I'm 68 and he's 2 years older than I am.
So he's 17.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
This one is from Lisa Ito. Hello, Nettie, and thank you very much for sharing your work and the story of the film. She's from the Concerned Artists of the Philippines and the UP College of Fine Arts. As the filmmaker, how would you look back and assess the impact of the work in sparking or sustaining awareness while circulated among audiences abroad of both
Mm.
the complexity and continuity of the armed struggle here in the Philippines?
Well, it was interesting because when we were making the film, um, the debate that I have dipped into a little bit about us being able to go underground continued during the editing of the film. And when we finished with the final cut, and we were headed to Berlin, there were some members of the movement who had seen it, and they were appalled. They thought, I thought the execution scene would be something that would be very, very difficult. Certainly for audiences, it was. But for people who are involved in this kind of complexity, the thing that really, really bothered them was that Dante comes out at the end of the film and says that armed struggle should be secondary. And this was, blasphemy in terms of people who were still very, very dedicated to the underground movement. So there was this huge debate that was happening about what would and wouldn't happen with A Rustling of Leaves when it was let out into the world. So the first thing that happened was we ended up at Berlin, and we walked into the theater, and it was close to 2,000 people in that theater. And when the screening was over, people just rose as one. And this was a European audience. And I thought, so we've got something that's really touched people. But what will happen in terms of further distribution? Because of that big win in Berlin, we were able to get distribution in Canada and in the United States in cinemas. And we started to play the film, and then we would have discussions afterwards. And let me just put this in context. Before Ninoy Aquino was assassinated, people in my country didn't even know where the Philippines was. And then with his assassination and Aquino coming to power and people power and that whole narrative as it spun out, people became a little bit more aware. But the idea that there was a substantial movement, both legally and underground in the Philippines, it was not within the Filipino community that was there, which was growing, but it wasn't huge. There was, of course, an awareness, but not beyond that. And what happened is that as the film started to move across Canada and across the United States and Europe, I can say, and I don't think I'm overstating the case, that A Rustling of Leaves played a substantial role in pulling people into into support groups. And I think it was because we had such extraordinary human stories there. I think it was because there were real surprises, because the voice of it was not a dogmatic lecture. It was the kind of movie where people would say to their buddy, "Hey, you got to check out this film. It's really wild." And then they would fall into the tapestry. And so I have been told by people that it was because of that film that the solidarity movement, particularly in the United States, really deepened. And I'm proud of that. I'm really proud of that. And the discussions afterwards, they were pointed and difficult, and the contradictions were hanging in the theater there. So I think it did its work outside of the country. Now I'm very intrigued to see what happens within the Philippines.
I think the film is very important because it does a lot of work in the cause of international solidarity in terms of Philippine concerns, no? Then and probably until now because of its continuing relevance. But it's also a kind of sensitivity that, in the ways the Philippines struggle and the personalities of the ultra conservative right have been humanized in the film. That we see them as human subjects capable of feelings and emotions, or have desires, and also a kind of commitment for whatever cause they were pursuing during that time, and segueing to the present time, up to this present time. So I think it's a very important film. And
Well, it means a lot, and I just have to say that those complexities and that nuance is entirely due to the Filipinos, like Jojo and other people who worked with me, so that they could make these very naive outside eyes, and this well-meaning, but out of it, heart. Somehow or another dance with these complexities, like any nuance that has survived and allowed that film to travel all these years. It really, it's thanks 100% to the Filipinos behind the camera who saw the opportunity in this outsider, who was curious but had a lot to learn.
But I'd like to mention a question which I should have asked earlier on. This is from Maris Panaligan of GMA News Online. Why did the film took so long to premiere in the Philippines, Nettie?
Well, I think there was, on my part, there was a real concern that it would compromise people. I mean, the first thing that, as Jojo said, the first thing I asked him was, are you safe? And what's going to happen when this film comes out? So there was a real concern. And also, just think of it. The film came out in 1989. Where in the Philippines were we going to show it? What cinema was going to show it? We had a film for commercial release, right? We prided ourselves in playing commercial cinemas and getting it broadcast, cutting through those kind of mainstream kind of bastions of media and taking this story out into that. Where in the world would we have done that? Where could we have shown an uncut version? And so that was one very big concern. And now it's really interesting. Like, I so wanted to be in the Philippines, not to be with you at this time, and with Jojo, and with many, many other people when A Rustling of Leaves is finally coming home. It's a killer. But it's interesting to think about something, Rustling of Leaves, going out digitally over the entire country, in a way that is safe. So maybe it's perfect. And maybe those 32 years, maybe there's enough distance to provide protection and encourage reflection. Maybe it's the perfect primer, or part of it. Part of, it's only a movie.
And there's a large inquiry of viewers because they cannot access the film if they're not in the Philippines. No? So a lot. I've also gotten inquiries from friends abroad that on how they could access the film, and how might they access the film, Nettie?
Well, they can come and find my company, CanadaWildProductions.com, and there you will find it, along with all of our other movies. So it's very, very easy. And, there's plans afoot to continue making A Rustling of Leaves available in the Philippines as well. So this is just the beginning.
And for both Nettie and Jojo, two questions. No? What happened to you after A Rustling of Leaves? And what are the ultimate lessons as a storyteller you gained from making it that informed the films you would do later?
Over to you, Jojo. And then I'll chime in. And I'm going to go get one little almond because it's really early in the morning and I'm starving. So while Jojo's talking, I'll be back in 2 secs.
Well, after the Rustling of Leaves, I went back again to as a photojournalist and dabbling with other forms of art like sculpture, sculpting, and also painting. And then finally, I was able to make my first film in 1991, and that's it. And then the following years, but I didn't want to go into the mainstream, so I stay on making documentary works. So
right, I remember yung Utah, your documentary film, even won sa best documentary sa CCP. That one CCP para sa video and pelikula. So how did it inform this? Even up to now, you're committed towards a progressive kind of culture and arts through your Facebook page, yung Urian page, So did that have anything to do or connections with the kind of work and commitment you did in A Rustling of Leaves?
yeah, from the very big, me as a person is really the kind of always connected to the people. So that's why I stick on to the kind of filmmaking and documentary because I really like making films that are really connected to people, and even in other art forms, I do a lot of community outreach program where there are street childrens and community childrens that I welcome to my studio at my art school for free. So I do workshops, photography and paintings, sculpture for free. So,
Thanks, Jojo. What about you, Nettie?
Well, A Rustling of Leaves, afterwards I went, oh, I guess I'm a filmmaker. It was, to say it was defining is an understatement. But I think that the thing that was really extraordinary with A Rustling of Leaves is that I came from a background of theater. And when you work as an actress, you are working in the world of understanding character, what the basic concepts of conflict are, and the kind of dramatic structure that goes into a piece to tell a story. And A Rustling of Leaves really taught me to hold on to those concepts. And so what I mean was, if you're going to really understand a story and how it works, you have to understand the conflict. And in order to understand the conflict, you have to do a couple of things when you make a movie. You have to find people who are active in what they're doing, just not talking about it. And in that, we found extraordinary people who were going to do what they were going to do, whether or not we were there with the camera, right? So our job became to be very, very nimble, try not and get in the way of what they were doing, and actually catch their action, the repeated action of their everyday lives that would lead us into understanding these people, to find the cinematic language and poetry. But the other is that it was very clear that I had to, in order to illuminate this conflict, I had to go and find the so-called two sides, many sides. And that's what took us, instead of just to the mountains, it took us to June Pala, it took us to Colonel Kalita, it took us to the right-wing paramilitaries, it took us on the road with the Partido ng Bayan, it got us into a lot of hot water on a lot of different levels. And it's difficult, because if you're saying to somebody like Ka Oris, okay, we're going to film you, but we're also going to be filming the military. And you're going to have to give me editorial control. And I have to say that to everybody in the film. And so I through A Rustling of Leaves, it was the beginning of understanding this was my job. And it's not to overstate it, because I think people around me were facing much bigger challenges, but it's hard. It's not an easy route to say to people, be vulnerable in front of my camera, but you don't have control of that story. Why should you do that? Why the heck should you do that? Any one of them on any quote side. And, you know, I think one of the things that you're riding on is that people really want their story out. They really, really want it to be told. And so there's a huge social contract that comes with that. And the big one is make a story that works, that shows the complexity, that's not propaganda, and then work like hell to distribute it. And so that was another thing I learned with A Rustling of Leaves. I was on the road for a year with A Rustling of Leaves, sleeping on people's floors and negotiating with cinema managers to get the film out, getting the prints all over, the physical 16 millimeter prints all over North America and Europe and also Australia. But I was driven by the fact that people had, by this social contract. It wasn't enough for me to go, oh, distribution's really difficult, and nobody's going to care about a film. It's not a mainstream film, and then go on to making another movie. Couldn't do that, and that became those patterns of storytelling, moving into difficult communities, always asking this really deep question of what the hell are you doing here as an outsider, and then the editing of A Rustling of Leaves took a good part of a year. That's a pattern that has followed me through all my films, and the distribution as well. So really, really was the beginning of a whole career. I've since moved into creating even more abstract pieces, both in terms of the big screen, but also in terms of art installations. And but underneath it, they're all driven by the same thing, is that if we can really, really capture the heart of the kind of cinema of what we're after, we can pull people who normally wouldn't care into that cinema or into that installation, and make people go, wow, what would I do? What would I do? The last big piece I did actually was we've filmed underwater the migration of endangered and wild sockeye salmon, and then through those images, using 8 projectors onto a bridge in Vancouver over an inlet. So our images were 1 kilometer long and 30 feet high, and up to 1,000 people could gather under the bridge and watch it. And it was less complex. Well, it was technically really complex because we were underwater, but less complex because fish don't talk back. But the whole point was, how do we pull people who, don't go to environmental meetings don't think about fish except to eat them. How do we pull them into caring? And so we thought, it's through poetry and cinematic wonder, we're going to create something that's just mind-blowing in terms of the form of the art and also the central characters, the fish themselves. And, you know, we ended up with an audience of 30,000 people over a summer. So I'm really enjoying that. So we're moving. I'm this bigger team of people that we have, some of whom go right back to A Rustling of Leaves, are working on these new art forms. We're moving into virtual reality with actually that show as well. So it's exciting times. It all started because of you guys. You got me into hot water, you Filipinos.
Thank you, Nettie.
You started it all.
A Rustling of Leaves is I think, a very important film because it provides at least Filipinos with a gift of memory, a gift of archive, especially in the time of this historical revisionism wherein dictators are heralded as heroes or given a hero's burial in the cemetery earmarked for heroes. No? But it provides that kind of clear continuum that the past still haunts the present, and Filipinos have a rich tradition of activism and struggle, and probably the longest and probably the sustainable kind of revolutionary movement still in place despite the problems that you pointed out in your documentary. It's also important because it provides a kind of clear landmark, marker film in which it provides a continuum also in terms of what would be the lead to a renaissance of documentary filmmaking in the country, as we're experiencing at this time, primarily led by women documentary filmmakers. So you provided that kind of landmark film in which it continues to inspire a newer generation of Filipino filmmakers, especially women, committed to the kinds of political causes
Fantastic.
and subaltern characters that you've also discussed in your documentary. So a way of ending this Q&A, which I hope our viewers were able to find meaningful and substantial. Maybe we can have a closing words first from Jojo and then from Nettie.
Thank you for giving this opportunity for us to talk straight to the Filipino people who are watching now. And thank you for Dang Docu. And thank you very much to Nettie that she's here to talk with us. And thanks a lot.
Salamat, Jojo. Nettie?
Well, yeah, a huge thanks to the festival for creating this extraordinary week and for helping A Rustling of Leaves do its job to reach the most important audience. I understand that it has made its way over the years on VHS and DVD out into the Philippines, but I'm hoping that these screenings get it further, get it past the choir. So I have a request for everybody who's seen it. If you think that it's in a film to share, please turn your friends onto it, get them to download it, but also do this. If your family's like my family, there are people who you love and care about who do not share the same political views that you have. That's the complexity of the world we live in. See if you can get them to watch the film. If you can bring one or two people who normally wouldn't fall into our audiences, see if you can do that. And I'd just be so intrigued to see if A Rustling of Leaves gets to shake people up in the way that those stories certainly did when we filmed them. And finally, every single one of these screenings is dedicated to those Filipinos who helped make this happen. So enjoy it, because really, it's your movie.
I hope everyone learned more about the film, the director, and our own history through the Q&A. The program Martial Law Never Again was a special edition. This Friday, October 2, Daang Docu goes full blast with a festival until November 5. New films are introduced every week, and most will stream free of charge for 7 days each. A Rustling of Leaves can be seen again on October 9 to 15. Thank you for joining us, Nettie. Thank you to you all viewers for joining us today. Please continue to support the Docu Festival. The main program starts on October 2 when the Docu virtual cinema opens again at angdocu.com/watch now. I'm Roland Tolentino. Magandang gabi sa ating lahat, and good morning, Nettie.
Have a good day. Night.
You have a good day, Nettie.
I think I'm going back to bed.
Mahirap kayo. Putang ina, sige. Magtiis kayo sa hirap at lutang.